Okay. Hopefully everybody's gotten a chance to trickle into the webinar. Just taking us live to YouTube now. Hello, everyone on YouTube. Sorry, just one moment. Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. My name's Elisa. I'm the events coordinator at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I would like to welcome you to PNP Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this virtual format tonight. At any point during the event, you can click on the link in the chat to purchase the Chinese Groove on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask Kathryn any questions by clicking on the Q&A button, which can be found near the bottom of your screen. And we'll try our best to get to everyone's questions, but we do apologize in advance if we don't have time to address yours. We'll also be providing closed captions if you click on the CC link right next to the Q&A box, also at the bottom of your screen. And finally, we want to thank you again for being here with us today. We're so thankful for our family of loyal customers that keep our business and our spirits afloat. And now I'd like to welcome to PNP Live, Kathryn Ma, celebrating the release of her book, The Chinese Groove. Kathryn Ma is the author of the widely praised novel, The Year She Left Us, which was named a New York Times Editor's Choice and an NPR Great Read of the Year. Her short story collection, All That Work and Still No Boys, won the Iowa Short Fiction Award and was named a San Francisco Chronicle Notable Book and a Los Angeles Times Discoveries Book. She's also a recipient of the David Nathan Meyerson Prize for Fiction and has twice been named San Francisco Public Library Laureate. Ma will be in conversation with David Young, Vice President for the Gandhi King Global Academy at the United States Institute of Peace in DC. For 4 decades, he has contributed to international support for peace, democracy, and human rights. Previously, he worked at the State Department of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the United Nations, and several NGOs. Young has also promoted peace building and the arts, including a puppet troupe of refugee children, cross-cultural theater projects with the Smithsonian Institution, and a partnership with the Moth on storytelling training for youth peace builders in conflict countries. So now, without further ado, please welcome Kathryn Ma and David Young to PNP Live.
Thanks so much, Elisa. Thanks to you and Politics and Prose for hosting this conversation between me and Kathryn Ma. Politics and Prose is one of America's great independent bookstores. Like all of the great ones, it started as a neighborhood bookstore and remains so today. It's a meeting place for friends and for families and for authors and readers. And now Politics and Prose is a virtual space too, as in today's session, and it enables us to have this DC-San Francisco connection. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi, David.
Is it foggy in San Francisco? It's nice and sunny here.
Always.
Congratulations on your beautiful book, beautiful and moving. I loved it, and I'll tell you all about my love for it. It's received outstanding reviews in so many publications already, just a month out. You hit the New York Times trifecta. Not only did you receive an excellent review by an author in the Times, you were selected as an editor's choice of the New York Times editors, and you're on the running list of best books of 2023, books you should be, quote, reading right now. So really, congratulations, all very much deserved. And how could it be, I won't quite say how many decades, but a lot of decades since we met in Berkeley when we were in grad school together. We discovered our fathers were from Yunnan province in China, which we'll get into through your book, which is unusual. Back then, not many immigrants from Yunnan province. And we shared an interest in literature and the theater, so much so that, as I remember it, we had a mutual dare of sorts where we said, why don't you take a beginning acting class at the great Asian American theater company in San Francisco? And no, why don't you? So we ended up doing it together. And I remember in our final scene class, our final class where we can invite friends and family, you and I did a funny scene from one of David Mamet's Two-Handers. And that was really a high point of my theater career. But more importantly, we were both searching as young Asian Americans for our voices. And so over the decades, I've been so happy to watch you find your voice so powerfully and so beautifully in your book of short stories, All That Work and Still No Boys, the greatest title ever. And then your first novel, The Year She Left Us. And now this beautiful book, The Chinese Groove. So I want to invite you to read, Kathryn, but first I'm going to show everybody the cover, remind them there's what looks to be this guy here leaping these very large, steep stairs. And I take it he is the protagonist, Zheng Shui Li, an 18-year-old young man from Gejiu, small city in China's Yunnan province. He goes by the English name Shelley. So Kathryn, welcome, and please introduce us to this leaper, Shelley.
Thank you, David. Thank you to our hosts at Politics and Prose. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to talk with you all, and thank you to those who have joined virtually. I'm just delighted. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to talk to you from San Francisco. Yes, the book is set in contemporary times, and it concerns a young man whose Western nickname is Shelley. He's 18 years old, and he lives in this area of China, of Southwest China, in Yunnan province. And his parents have decided that, had decided years ago that his greatest opportunity would be to someday leave his hometown and go to the United States and try to make his way in the world. His mother has passed, and his father is now determined to see him fulfill that promise that they made to his mother. So I thought I'd just read just from the very beginning of the book, because the book is narrated by Shelley, and he has a very distinctive narrative voice. And this will just give you I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. It'll just give you a little taste of Shelley's unique way of encountering the world. So this is from chapter 1, The Chinese Groove. And now you need to imagine me as an 18-year-old young man. The relatives treated me rudely, beating me and calling me names. And so on my 18th birthday, my father buried his head in his hands and cried until the bottle was empty and his tears were spent, and he was at last decided it was time to let me go. Grubs like us didn't get many chances, and he'd promised mother before she died that he'd send me, their son and only child, away from this unhappy life and into a brighter world. There was an uncle, he said, conveniently rich, living in San Francisco. I should leave our home in Gejiu, Yunnan province, the most beautiful realm in all of China, and move in with uncle and figure out from there foot in the door and student visa and green card and a score of other words my father called out in the weeks that followed as I cleaned our shoes and boiled our broth and swept our single room, words that made no sense to me, but ladled not an ounce of care into my black-haired head. I was all for the plan, bathed in mother's dream for me. I'd been waiting for years to depart. I didn't want to be like my friends who were lined up to work at the World Crafts tin factory. Theirs wasn't the fate for me. My future lay outside those gates. For where in a factory could I become the man I intended to be, which was a cool guy and a poet? I told my father yes. The relatives hated me for ancestor reasons, which you might think unfair, but I well understood, because I was born into the despised branch of the family. My great-grandfather, a handsome devil, was known to all as the wayward son of his father's third wife, a gambler and an opium addict. The son, not the wife, though who knows, maybe the third wife ate the flour too. In the photo my father has of her, she's really skinny. My father knew how tough it was to be the bastard son of the bastard son of a bastard. Okay, maybe not that many bastards, and technically untrue. Third wives were all the rage in the ancient days of yore to those with brains and money. But as far as the aunties were concerned, father and I were lodged on the lowest rung of the family ladder, and nothing we could do would lift us from the mud. From where I stood in proud Guizhou, tin capital of China, but lousy with kicking cousins, I couldn't quit soon enough. I'd hold father in a warm embrace and promise to make him proud. Then I'd soar straight to uncle's house, where my new family was waiting. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Beautiful. What a beautiful opening. Hey, I'm the grandson of a third wife concubine, so I really identified with Shelley in very real ways. In fact, I think I told you I've read the book twice already because I loved it so much. The first time I was so entranced by Shelley. He was my immigrant superhero, and so I grabbed on, my wife will attest to this, I grabbed onto his superhero cape and just whizzed through the book almost in a handful of hours because I wanted to see how my superhero fared by the end of the book. And then I read it a second time after we organized this conversation because I wanted to more slowly appreciate the nuance and the beauty of the language and the plot and the characters. So let me ask you, Kathryn, why did you root your story in this funny person Shelley and in the place of Guizhou, the tin capital of Yunnan, China? And what does it have to do with your family history, if at all?
Yeah, I these things happen so mysteriously. I don't know that I was that conscious of it when I began. But there is a family story that is one of the points of origin for the book, and I think that it lodged in my memory and lodged somehow in my being. And when it came time to write this new novel, it bubbled to the surface for me. So my dad, as David has said, my dad is from an area of southwestern China, Yunnan province. He's not from the town that my hero Shelley is from, but he is from Yunnan province. And he left as a young man, he left as a student, and came to the United States, always intending to return to China. He was really just coming to the US for education, but due to all the upheaval of the middle of the 20th century, he was never allowed and never able to return to his home and his family. But many years later, when I was already an adult, my parents, my father, my mother, myself, and my younger brother, we traveled to my father's hometown. It was the first time my dad had been back to his hometown in many decades. And it was a profound trip for all of us. And when we were there, we encountered one relative, an older man of my dad's generation, whom the rest of the family really would not speak to. He was quite shunned by the rest of the family, although he was permitted to be part of the family events. No one was speaking to him. Everyone was ignoring him. And I could never get the full story from my father. He really was very reluctant to talk about this gentleman, and I tried to find out about him, but there wasn't much information forthcoming. So I had to kind of make up a history for him. But at the same time, I thought, in some ways, there was an analogy there to me of the immigrant's fate, that you maybe become part of a society or a community, but you're sort of invisible, or at least you're not fully seen by the people around you. And I decided to give this character a later descendant. I just had it in me that I really wanted to write from the point of view of a young man, and that's when the idea of this character came to me. And when I began writing, the voice came to me so easily. I'm not quite sure how I located it or where it came, but it immediately became clear to me that I was just going to have a marvelous fun writing in this sort of breezy, semi-serious, semi-satirical, always buoyant voice of my hero Shelley.
Thanks for sharing that story. So tell us, he's a poet. He wants to be a poet and a cool guy. So who gave him the name Shelley? Did he give it to himself?
So Shelley, as I said earlier, his mother she died when he was a little boy, but she really had the thought that she wanted him to learn English and to go someday to the US. And so in fulfilling a promise to his late wife, Shelley's father finds a tutor for him. This all happens really before the book begins. When we meet Shelley, he has learned English to some degree, and he has been tutored by a British woman who was teaching in his province. And he calls her Miss Chips. That's his nickname for her. And she's endowed him with the name of her favorite English poet, Shelley. It sounds a little bit like his Chinese name. So that's, when we sometimes, it's kind of a practice that sometimes someone with a Chinese name will choose a Western name that phonetically sounds similar. My dad, when he was choosing his Western name, he wanted it to start with a J sound. This is the family lore. Who knows exactly how true this is, but the family story is when he first came to the United States, he went to study first at the University of Illinois and then at Ohio State University, where he met my mother, also an immigrant from China, also studying at Ohio State University in the late 40s, following World War II. And my dad chose the name Joseph, which he thought was somewhat dignified, but then all of his American pals started calling him Joey, which he didn't like. So then he changed it to James. So we had always known my dad as James. But much later in life, when I met some of my father's and mother's old schoolmates from Ohio, it always made me laugh because they always referred to my dad as Jimmy.
That's funny.
Did your dad have a Western name, David?
Tommy.
Tommy, yes.
Tommy Young. His name was Tama Ziyu Yang. Yang Ziyu was his Chinese name, but a lot of his friends called him Tommy. Before I forget, so Kathryn gives Shelley his Chinese name Shui Li, and because he goes by Shelley, so we never fully know his Chinese characters of Shui Li. But since, as I told you, he became my superhero very quickly, I named him Shui Li, which means like a force of learning. You'll see when you read the book, everybody, Shelley is like this sponge of language, of learning, of history, of stories. And so I thought Shui Li, learning force, was my nickname for Shelley. But Kathryn, so I have, as you know, many spies out in the world. And so, i.e. one of my sons went to your New York launch at You and Me bookstore in Chinatown. And he said you told a funny story of Shelley's voice literally inhabiting you. And you had an embarrassing moment in a library as you were typing away passages to the book. Do you want to tell that story? Because
I wanted to set myself a technical challenge in writing this book. I actually wanted to try to do something I hadn't done before as a writer, and narrate an entire book told in a single voice. In my previous novel, there were alternating voices, and this time I thought I want the whole book to be told in a single point of view, from a first-person point of view. It turns out that it's very hard to do that. It's actually very hard to do that, because unless your character is in every single scene, it constrains you somewhat. I found ways to work around that. I used different techniques to have Shelley imagine scenes between other people or eavesdrop on scenes, and it was interesting from a craft point of view to work that out. But it's true that I really felt inhabited by his voice. And one day when I was working in the library at the medical school at University of California, San Francisco, a young medical student, I was wearing headphones, and a young medical student came up and scolded me because he said I was speaking out loud. So apparently when I was writing this book, I was always talking to myself, but I didn't realize it. It was very important to me to get that voice right. And I worked long and hard on that, because much of the book is also about the theme of storytelling and how we use stories to communicate with one another, and how storytelling is a way for one generation to pass their history and their values and their mythologies on to the next generation. That's a theme that runs through the book, and that's something that Shelley inhabits.
Great. I want to get deeper into the theme of storytelling in your novel. First, I want to ask you the title, The Chinese Groove. And like I was saying, Shelley's my superhero. So for me, The Chinese Groove in my reading is both Shelley's superpower, like Superman, to fly, but at one and the same time, it's also his kryptonite, so to speak. So I wanted to ask you, in your view, what's Shelley's dual notion of the Chinese groove? First, what is it, and what is its duality to Shelley, and then to you as the author?
So the basic plot of the book is that Shelley leaves his home in Yunnan, and he leaves his father. His father's still grieving the death of his late wife, and not much good in the world, his father. He's sort of curled up in a little ball, metaphorically. He can't do much of anything other than send his son out in the world. And Shelley comes to San Francisco. As I said, it's set in the contemporary times, and he imposes himself, or tries to impose himself, on the lives of these distant American relatives. He has an uncle and aunt who live in San Francisco. He imagines that they live in this beautiful, rich palace of a home, and that when he gets there, they're going to set him up with a job and money and an easy life, and he's going to have it completely made. But when he gets to the United States, he finds out, to his dismay, that nothing is as he dreamed it would be. And his American relatives want really nothing to do with this 18-year-old bounder who's trying to force his way into their lives. When Shelley is starting out on this journey, he comes up with this idea that he calls the Chinese groove. It's just a pure Shelleyism. He just made it up, and I made it up for the book. It's this idea he has that he has a safety net wherever he goes in the world, as long as he finds other people from China. He calls them his countrymen. They are going to be there for him. They're going to lend him a helping hand. They're going to make sure he doesn't fail. And he puts a lot of faith into that. And that's one of the reasons why he thinks these relatives are bound by duty and by the Chinese groove to make sure that he is going to land well. So it's a hope for him, but it's also a hazard, because he puts too much faith into it, and it gets him into trouble. And of course, in a hero's journey story, you always want to set challenges and obstacles for the hero, and you always want to set troubles upon them and see how they deal with them. So that's the idea behind the Chinese groove. It's not I think special particularly to the Chinese American community or to the Chinese diaspora. Lots of groups, whether they're ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups, community group, neighborhood groups, or what state you come from, wherever. There are different ways that people identify themselves, and different comforts and constraints that people encounter in holding fast to certain identities. And another theme of the book is identity. How do we consider ourselves? What do we do in a diverse society when many labels might apply to us? Shelley's very confused by that when he comes to San Francisco, because San Francisco is such a place of progressive thought and such a diverse population. And he thinks that's fantastic, and it's going to be an easy place to live, and they're always going to make room for him and welcome the stranger through the doors. But when he gets to San Francisco, he finds out nothing is as it seems, and nothing is easy. And so he has to make his way. So identity, diversity, these are other themes that run through the book, and his adventures are a vehicle for looking at some of those issues.
I remember the novelist who reviewed your book in the New York Times, and he was saying exactly what you said. He's an immigrant from Kashmir in Pakistan, and he was saying there's a Pakistani groove, so to speak, and he was saying his parents often hosted fellow Kashmiris who would rummage through the phone book in their small town and look for names that were familiar and called them up and said, hello, we're new immigrants. And then they would host them for dinner, and it was their version of the groove. So he was very moved by the groove.
Yeah. Woman reviewer, but she puts her finger, I think, on something that's universal, particularly perhaps in immigrant populations where you're far from home, you don't have a base of your familiar community around you, and one of the things that is both, again, a hope and a hazard for Shelley is the exuberance of youth. I mean, what's more optimistic than a teenager sort of bounding up the stairs, as you showed us on the cover, who wants to experience everything in life. He's very excited by the opportunities, but also hasn't been seasoned yet, and so has to go through a number of challenges and a number of problems, and the family that he hopes to connect with in San Francisco. One of the reasons that they don't really want Shelley in their midst is they have a grief of their own that they're trying to deal with. So there's a parallel in the book. There's the family in China, there's the family in California, and each in their own way are dealing with some very traumatic events which have left them quite adrift. And that's something that was important to me to capture. The tone I was striving for in the book was one that was a balance between telling Shelley with all the exuberance and humor that he brings to the page, but also dealing with some serious issues. My interest in some of the multicultural issues that San Francisco and other places face. My interest in modern politics. There's some legal issues that find their way into the story, and then the satirical elements of the story. So kind of moving through that tonal range. That was another goal I had for the book, and people seem to be responding to that, which I'm very grateful for.
Let's explore that. The reviews I read saw it as really the book's hallmark. That is, you have this exuberant Shelley, and you frame him around twin tales of grief in a way. The grief he's fleeing in China and in his Chinese family, and the grief he stumbles into in his, unbeknownst to him, his Chinese American family. And so it must have been a high wire act to pull it off, which you seem to have done brilliantly. And so tell us about that process of you as the writer walking that high wire.
I think life is so often lived in the day-to-day on the surface. Like we're moving through our lives with all of the strength and resilience that we can bring to it, but often there are very deep sorrows in our lives. In the case of an immigrant family, there's much that they have lost. They've left behind, the great separation from their own family history, their own family origins, and the newness of everything must be quite bewildering and leave them with sadness. There's personal loss that's described in the novel, personal grief, and I think the book tries to examine how do we function in the world where we're both moving through life and doing what we need to do to live complete and fulfilled lives, while also being very cognizant at times and sometimes less cognizant, but nevertheless affected by the river of sadness that always flows beneath our feet. I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the juxtaposition of the everyday, and then the highs of joy, and then the deep lows of grief and sorrow. How that is accomplished as a writer is, it's tricky. I think one feels one's way very tentatively at first. I'm not a writer who does a lot of outlining or planning beforehand. I just build a book scene by scene by scene. And I think I was drawn to the humor because I felt this story I felt the sadness of the story very keenly. And I think I was drawn to the humor because I think humor allows us those resting moments when we can sort of open ourselves to a wider emotional range. Humor allows us to take a breath, maybe, or at least just to have a little rest from the intensity of sadness and grief. And that's why I wanted to try to do both those things at once. I was very lucky. I'm so pleased. I had such a good experience with working with my editor, Dan Lopez at Counterpoint Press. He understood very early on my desire to write at these different levels, to have the book succeed on a comic level, to have the book succeed on a more serious, sober level. And he really worked with me to try to achieve that broad tonal range. So I'm thankful for that.
Yes. Well, you succeeded beautifully, and hats off to your editor too for supporting you in that. And if I could probe a little further. So what I loved about Shelley, besides being a superhero, was he's also an old soul. He's not this 18-year-old goofball poet, cool guy. His arc, his emotional arc through the course of the book, without giving away the plot, is very profound. He does find himself bouncing from Gudjoe grief to San Francisco grief, and he sort of uses his wiles. Partly he uses the Chinese groove as a tool, partly he finds the Chinese groove as a useless tool in trying to bridge grief in a way. And so tell us about, without giving away the plot, Shelley's arc, rather than just being a kind of 18-year-old happy, lucky guy.
Yeah, I mean, Shelley's arc is part of the. We were talking earlier about storytelling, and stories, to me, the best kinds of stories truly do have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Shelley, I think as readers of long works of fiction, of novels, we want to move with the characters through a kind of emotional path. It's satisfying to us as readers, or it is to me as a reader, to begin with possibility and then see a set of characters move through a variety of actions and reactions, and then bring, at the end, not necessarily answer all the questions, but I love books that bring us to a sense of having experienced something, just that we have a feeling. I didn't know how the book was going to end, but I did have a sense of the kind of feeling I wanted to leave the readers with. Shelley's mother has taught him as a child a lot of legends and folklores, and Shelley's father loves to make up little stories from things he sees on the street every day. And one of the stories that his parents have told him is a famous Chinese legend called the story of the peach blossom forest. This is a story that I never learned as a child. I actually didn't encounter this story until I saw a play in my adult years called The Secret Love in Peach Blossom Forest, which is by the Taiwanese-American playwright Stan Lai. It's a wonderful play, and it introduced me to this story of the peach blossom forest, which is a kind of classic tale of the land that is the land of perfect harmony and grace, someplace else, someplace almost always inaccessible, a Shangri-La or a Brigadoon, someplace that the stranger stumbles into and learns that, oh, people can live harmoniously. And that's how Shelley thinks of San Francisco. San Francisco is going to be his peach blossom forest. So we do have a very, a kind of skeletal, maybe it's kind of a scaffolding for the book in terms of Shelley's journey. He's setting out. He's like the fisherman going to the peach blossom forest. In a way, it's not a perfect analogy, but it was sort of in my mind as I wrote the book. I love this idea that there's some better place out there. There's some place waiting for us. And then when you actually encounter reality, you realize, oh no, we have to make that place for ourselves. There's no magic kingdom waiting for us. We really, in this life anyway, we need to make that place for ourselves. We need to grapple with what's hard. And, another part about the book is how difficult it is to communicate with one another. And that's why I say the book, plays with the idea that we use stories in order to communicate with one another, because sometimes it's just too painful to try to speak to each other directly. So that's part of what Shelley's journey is.
Mm. There's one great question in the chat. I'm going to ask you one more question about storytelling, since you raised it and the Peach Blossom Forest tale. And then I'm going to turn to our audience members' question because it's related. So let me ask you about storytelling. So novelists, of course, are storytellers. And then you choose to make not just Shelley, but many of your central characters in the book self-identified storytellers. They love stories like all old world civilizations. Chinese culture embraces the oral tradition of storytelling. I think of Maxine Hong Kingston's beautiful early books about, she coined a new verb, talk story. And so Shelley, his father's a storyteller, his Chinese American uncle and aunt are self-described storytellers of sorts. What's the importance of storytelling characters in your story? And why was it important for you to make so many of them storytellers? And how did their different styles of storytelling mesh or not? And how was that part of the tale of two griefs in a way?
Yeah, I wanted to consider the different forms in which we tell each other stories. There's everything from the formal, a kind of formal legend or folklore that or an ancient one, I should say, not formal, that gets passed from generation to generation, like this legend of the Peach Blossom Forest, but also the way in which we conjure up stories in the most casual or informal ways, and the ways in which we deceive ourselves by telling ourselves stories about ourselves or about the people in our lives that perhaps block us, at least for a time, from seeing ourselves or seeing those around us clearly. So I think I tried to do it in a subtle way, to offer a variety of experiences of storytelling. The other thing that was very important to me in writing the book, because it is it's somewhat comic in tone and somewhat satirical in tone, in some ways, I wanted there to be a lot of subplots to this book. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about, you've talked about Shelley's journey. Of course, that's the overarching subplot, but beneath that, there are several subplots. So there's a sort of, big arching plot. And then there are several subplots that loop underneath that, because I think that's part of the fun of writing a novel, the fun of reading a novel. And I worked hard on that. I wanted to send a lot of planes into the air, and then at the end of the book, try to bring everything down for a safe landing. And storytelling was part of that, by having a lot of different kinds of storytellers in the book that allowed me to sort of play with all these different subplots and keep the pages turning. I mean, as a novelist, I love the beginnings, the openings of books, because as I mentioned before, that it opens so many possibilities. And then I love to write the ends of books, because if I've done my job along the way, an ending comes to me pretty surely. I don't know how it's going to end when I start a book, but then somehow the ending gathers itself up, and the ending to this book was a real gift to me. I felt it with real certainty. But middles of books are really hard. Middles are hard. And so by creating all these different subplots, it was kind of a way to keep myself moving the story forward and keeping the pacing up, and keeping it a very fun. You mentioned it, you read it the first time really just to find out what happens to Shelley, and that's like music to my ears. That's music to my ears, because that means that the story was pulling you forward with a pretty strong gravitational pull, and that's how I like to read too. That's how I like to read.
Yeah, I liked how the planes ended. Literally on the last page, all the planes, and if there's time, we'll get to that. But I wanted to say one more thing about the storytelling within the storytelling that you created. And what I loved in the messy middle, so to speak, you mentioned you loved writing beginnings and endings, or the endings write themselves in a way. But what I loved about the messy middle of your book, when everything was in play and all the planes were in the air, and sometimes different characters and sometimes the same character had a love-hate relationship with their own storytelling. It was both, on the one hand, a source of comfort to tell a story to somebody in crisis, in need. On the other hand, others, or maybe Shelley himself, viewed storytelling as a crutch to hide from a painful truth. And so both are true, and it was a beautiful, messy middle, I thought.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read this very incisive question. They write, there is another parallel in the book, the relationship between Shelley and his father. On the one hand, the relationship between Shelley's cousin and his father. What interested you about the dynamic between fathers and sons? So there's definitely, the twin griefs are father-son relationships in a way.
Yeah, this is really, this novel is about fathers and sons. That's absolutely right. This is a novel that has two pairs of fathers and sons, Shelley and the father he's left behind in China. And then when he comes to the US and he meets these American relatives, he meets whom he calls his uncle. It's actually a distant cousin, but by Chinese custom, he calls him his uncle. And the uncle has an elderly father with whom he has a very fractured relationship. And so we see the unspooling of these two pairs of fathers and sons, and the difficulties they encounter separately, and how their individual experiences reflect on the experiences of the other pairing. I just loved being able to write from the point of view of a young man, and to really think about how fathers and sons relate to one another. I missed my father so much. I think in some ways this book was a kind of yearning for my father. And I just felt very fortunate that I had the chance to go deep. I mean, this book does not take place in my father's hometown, and it doesn't, the hero isn't really an iteration of my father, not in the least. He's he's had a very different temperament and character than my dad did. But I do think, and David, you can speak to this too, as descendants of immigrant parents, I do think the unspoken lives on in us. I think we do carry the legacy of our parents' experiences, the kind of loss that they experienced in leaving their home countries, the kind of grief that they experienced in being separated from their family. My father left as a young man in his early 20s, thinking he would return to his home again, thinking he would see his parents and siblings again, and he never got the chance to go back. I can't imagine how painful that must have been. And so some of that experience of my father's of what I imagined to be my father's sorrow went into the creation of these of the father characters in this book and the father-son relationships. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, it was a wonderful question. Let me check for more. Oh, yes. Thank you for the second question. I attend a monthly storytelling series. Speak is the name of the series, out of Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And the discussion this evening made me wonder if you could see yourself telling Shelley's story orally in a storytelling setting, or perhaps as a writer, you see that the two art forms could overlap in such a way, or not. Great question.
Yeah, great question. Well, I'm very inspired by the storytelling that happens in those in that kind of environment where people are, I mean, it takes raw nerve. Good for you. Good for you that you're involved in that. I think that takes raw nerve to get up and stand up in front of an audience and share a story like that. So I'm very inspired by it. I'm not so interested in doing it myself because I just love rearranging words on a page. I mean, I just love it. I became a writer because I was the kind of kid who just read books all the time. I was an avid reader as a child, and there's something so deeply engrossing to me, which is the highest form of happiness, I think, to be deeply engrossed in work. Deeply engrossing to me in writing sentences and rearranging those words on a page and having absolute control over the line, over the pacing, or to mix it up, to write a long sentence and write a short sentence and then write dialogue and write scene. What I also really love, and David alluded to this early when he was talking about our early and thankfully very short-lived acting careers. I love dramatic storytelling. I love playhouse. I love going to playhouses. I love going to plays. And I think I was probably pretty deeply influenced by having gone to the theater so much and seeing a lot of plays. I think some of that influence crept into the book. And in fact, when I finished the book, I mean, the book was all done. I was already holding it in my hands. I didn't even know what I had because I didn't know what I had done until the book was done and finished, and I was looking at it again, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have in a way I've written a kind of version of that great play, The Servant of Two Masters. Maybe some of you know it, that great Commedia dell'arte play, because Shelley, in a way, is that sort of both knowing and somewhat hapless servant who ends up having to juggle a lot of things in order to survive. He's always looking for his next gig because he has no job, he has no money, he has no prospects. The Chinese groove has failed him. His relatives have failed him. He's got to go out into the world and make his way. And so after the book was finished, I thought, I've seen that play more than once, maybe in a way. That kind of seeped into my consciousness, and I built upon that idea that just that comedy, the what there's so many different ways to get at comedy, but that comedy of escalation where you have a central figure and they've got themselves in a bit of a pickle, and then they have to keep, they have to keep juggling more and more and more to keep the gambit going. That was fun to think about that. So I think I was more affected by what happens on stage than I am in the more informal kind of storytelling that the person who gave us this question is. But I do admire the storytelling there, and I think it's been a wonderful addition to our cultural conversation to have all these great storytelling programs now.
Another of our audience members, Kathryn, asks, is there a message you hope your reader learns from reading this book?
I don't think so. I think the novelist who enters into the project with a message is going to write a pretty, I don't know. For me, I want there to be more questions posed, and more ideas that might spark ideas and musings of your own. But no, I don't really write a novel in order to convey any one particular message. I write it for enjoyment. I write it for entertainment. I write it for myself in order to look hard at things that really occupy me, and maybe even one might say obsess me. I have a couple of themes that I find that I return to over and over in my writing. And one of them is this question of how you live with joy and happiness when there is so much sadness in life. And another is how you make an individual life, but still remain within the family. Because I think that's a great tension. That's a big challenge. How do you, and I have children of my own, and I so desperately want them to feel the freedom to develop their own lives and go out into the world with strength and resilience and independence. But of course, I want them to stay in the family fold too. So I think that's a constant tension. And those are some of the themes that obsess me without any particular message or resolution of those themes.
Well, as we wait for more audience questions, let me ask you, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about San Francisco as the American setting of the story, Gudjo here and San Francisco here. How long have you lived in San Francisco? What role does San Francisco, not just the city, but the neighborhoods and the types of housing play in your novel? And, in a way, it's the terminus. Your dad started in Yunnan and Gudjo and Mugza, a little village outside of Gudjo, and you, the daughter, are in San Francisco. So how long have you lived there, and reflect on the character of San Francisco in your story?
Yeah, San Francisco is important to the story, although it's not purely a San Francisco novel. It is very much a set in a specific neighborhood in San Francisco. It's a neighborhood called the Outer Sunset District. It's way to the west in San Francisco, deep in the fog. And it's a place that got the housing there was developed in the early part of the 20th century. And it was a place where working class and middle class families could afford to buy homes. Originally, it was a place that tried to keep out Chinese and other people of color, Jews. There were restrictive covenants all throughout this area, much like there were in other suburban areas of the in suburban areas of the country or other cities. But it became a place where, because it was more affordable, it became a place where Chinese residents who were living in Chinatown, San Francisco, when they were ready to leave Chinatown and when they were allowed to leave Chinatown, this was a neighborhood that Chinese moved to. And so it has a fascinating history to me. And the book considers some of that. The book looks at this stumper of an issue for San Francisco, affordable housing. How do we, where do people live in San Francisco? How do people afford to live in San Francisco? And it considers this idea of a migration within a city. So we have Shelley's immigration, his migration from one country to another, but we also have the migration of his relatives from their origins in Chinatown, San Francisco, to an outer neighborhood, and that was all very interesting to me. And I loved. We were talking about storytelling earlier. One of the things I did was I went out and collected oral histories from some residents in the Bay Area whose families had made that migration from Chinatown, San Francisco, to the outer neighborhoods of San Francisco, and what that disruption was like. What was it like to leave one community and go to another, ostensibly for opportunity, but also encountering obstacles and prejudice along the way. But yeah, Shelley, because he arrives in San Francisco and he really has no safety net. He bounces from one kind of housing to another. So we see him, desperately trying to find a place to live, and that allowed me to kind of move the spotlight for a while from one kind of housing situation to another, which was fun to research and fun to play out on the page.
Mm. Well, since you love ending so much, let me ask you. Well, first, I think I have one more question, so I owe it to our audience members to ask.
Yeah.
One of those many subplots is about political corruption. So we have a reader of the book. What role in Shelley's arc does that scandal play?
That was great fun to write. There is a whole subplot about local corruption, and it's so easy to find instances of political corruption at the local level at any city. San Francisco is not immune to that. And one of the kind of running jokes of the book is how pleased San Francisco is with itself. Okay, lots of cities feel this way about themselves. But San Francisco has a certain pride in it being very progressive, very diverse, being politically astute and welcoming voices of all kinds, and I play with that a little bit, and we have a little bit of a disappointment and a downfall, shall we say, of a local politician. I just wanted to poke a little fun there. There's a little mild satire in the book, David, you asked me before we had this conversation today. You were asking about influences, and I told you that I did have Voltaire's Candide in mind when I sort of came up with the idea of a young man who goes out into the world. I'm not nearly the vicious satirist that Voltaire was in Candide, but I take it upon myself to maybe puncture a few balloons, puncture a few ideas about modern living. The great experiment in multiculturalism that is played out in San Francisco. I take great pride in it as a San Francisco resident. I love my hometown. I'm very proud of us, but of course we fall short of our peach blossom harmony, our ideal of peach blossom land harmony. We're always striving to do a little better.
As we begin wrapping up, I wanted to say a personal thanks. It's both great to have this conversation with you as old friends, but also I want to thank you for writing about the Yunnan immigrant experience in a way. I never think about this as much, but my mother and father were a cross-cultural marriage in a way. My mother was a Cantonese immigrant. My father was a Yunnanese immigrant refugee in many ways. And they were different cultures, and they were different streams of Chinese immigration to the US. They came together, but still the subcultures they represented. And I found very powerful in the book how the Yunnanese strain of the family amidst all his Cantonese neighbors and friends, how the two, what I call wavelets to you, kind of ebbed and flowed around each other. And so it was a beautiful, rich Chinese American story, and obviously a very universal story as well. So thanks so much for your imagination gifting that to us. And I'm gonna check to see if there are any others. No, I think we got all the questions we were gonna get. Hi, Lisa.
Hello. I just want to say thank you so much to both of you again for joining us. It was a really great discussion. Thank you to our audience members for submitting such great questions as well. And just thank you everybody for taking the time to be here. Your patronage is what enables us to bring programming like this to you, and we can't continue to host these types of events without the book sales to support them. So please make sure that you click the link in the chat to purchase The Chinese Groove by Kathryn Ma. And also be sure to check out our website for our most current and updated event listings. We have a lot of great virtual and in-person events. A lot of those in-person events are now being live streamed and posted to our YouTube. So please check those out. And we hope to see you there. So thank you again to Kathryn and David. Stay well read, everyone, and have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thanks, Politics.
Thanks, Kathryn.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Elisa.